There's a lot of games. There's like so many games. Like, so many games. Have you ever tried to just bump into a new game on the Switch? Go on, try. It's impossible. Steam is a little better for the tools it gives the user, but even then you're digging through an enormous catalog that's growing at an alarming rate. Are you looking for an RPG? Well, prepare your pearl clutching hand because you're gonna have to see a lot of awkwardly drawn RPG Maker porn along the way. In 2022 alone, Steam published nearly 11,000 games worldwide. That's more than a 25% increase from the number of games they released in 2018. In the past 5 years, Steam has added over 46,000 games to their platform. Assuming you wanted to play them all and averaged 3 hours on each one, you would need a ballpark of 15 years to get that job done. And that was a lot of shoddy, maybe wrong math to say this. Damn, that's a whole lot of games. I like finding new gems though, and I thought a great way to channel my ADHD would be to make a video sharing some of the games I found interesting or noteworthy over the past couple months. This entailed spending more hours than I would like to admit perusing the Steam storefront, compiling fun, unique looking indie RPGs. After spending untold hours searching, I ended up with about 30 and gave them each about 2 hours or so of playtime before deciding what would make the cut and digging deeper for the video. Oh, that's weird. Steam's refund window is 2 hours. Huh, strange. Also, we all know RPG is a bit of a loaded term, so I tried to pull from a wide variety of games, and I ended up with everything from comedy to very grim post-apocalypse. But in the hopes of not making my list redundant with the many other indie RPG lists everyone else recommends, there's a set of criteria I've added in the hopes that this list stays more interesting throughout. First, the game must have under 4,000 reviews. According to Game World Observer, the median is about 1 in every 30 users leave a review. This is a very rough standard, but it's enough for my needs. That means games under 4,000 reviews probably have a player base of under 200,000 people. That sounds indie enough to me. Second, I'm going to try and avoid games from any bigger publishers. So no matter how much I think Labyrinth of Refrain: Coven of Dusk, rolls off the tongue, is an indie game, I gotta think a little smaller. My hope is to have come up with a list of games that might have a few surprises even for the RPG fanatic out there. I get to play a bunch of weird games, and maybe you get to find something new to put on your radar, which I count as a win-win. Let's get started. Do you hear that? That wonderfully moody piece is Vagante's opening track by composer Sam English. This rather sad, contemplative song filled with longing is a great way to set the tone for the game you're about to experience. Vagante is a roguelike in the very unforgiving, old-school roguelike sense. I'd say roguelikes have two schools of thought. There's the meta-progression approach, where you play to unlock the ability to win. Then there's the gameplay knowledge approach, wherein learning what the game can throw at you creates mastery over time. Sometimes the word roguelike and roguelite are employed to create some distinction between the two, but with so many elements being loosely shared, the whole thing gets a little bit pedantic in my opinion. So instead, it might just be better to say, the more you learn about how Vagante works, the easier it'll become to win. You can unlock backgrounds for your characters, which might help you play the style you like or add some variety, but nothing you need to succeed is hidden behind progress. This game is of the very old school mindset. Until you learn what it's going to toss your way, you're going to have a bad time. It's the kind of game I personally have to be in the exact right mindset for, kind of like its non-fantasy cousin Spelunky. Unsurprisingly, the game's creators have cited Spelunky and other classic fantasy dungeon crawlers among its influences. Calling this Spelunky with level ups might be a mistake though. It merges the two gameplay styles into something that feels fresh enough to really set itself apart from both its influences. Graphically, the game is very earthy with its color palette. You'll notice lots of soft, mossy greens, tame browns, and dusty stone colors abound in this game. It stands in stark opposition to what I would say is a sometimes very colorful genre. Even normally warm colors like red are muted and dark here. It goes a long way in setting the right tone for the game. The 2D pixel art reminds me a little of SNES era work, but looking closely you're going to see far more detail than that system could ever handle. That, coupled with the source lighting from your character, spells, and objects in the environment, go a long way to creating a dank, ancient dungeon with unknowable caverns. After a very short and mostly thorough tutorial preparing you for the basics, Vagante drops you pretty much right into the deep end of the pool. And this pool is a cave. My metaphor fell apart immediately. The first section of the dungeon is the caves, and they're almost immediately unwelcoming. Thanks to the very small amount of light the game gives you, you're already standing at a threshold the moment you enter. This procedurally generated dungeon means business. If you aren't paying attention in your limited visibility, you might just step on a pressure plate and end your adventure very quickly. To call Vagante's levels brutal might be a little bit of an understatement. Traps aside, you'll be spending the bulk of the game fighting the denizens of the dungeon as you explore its depths. Killing monsters grants you experience, which you can use to boost select stats and unlock new abilities, making exploring easier, and you'll want all the help you can get. Building your character can feel a bit Sisyphean at times starting out. Dying and returning to the door at level 1 means you have to go through 3 to 4 floors of the dungeon before you begin to unlock any impactful abilities. Once you do though, you're given a decent amount of freedom to build your character. Not to mention unique items with effects and spells you find along your way, which will drastically change how you approach the dungeon. Sometimes the gear you find really changes up the way you play, meaning if you really wanted to, you could be a wizard who uses swords and strength. You'd be missing out on some moves, but it might be worth it if you find the right treasure. Classes include the Knight, Rogue, Wizard, Wildling, and Houndmaster. Each class has their own skill tree. Once you gain a level, you're able to place points in stats and skills. The Knight, for example, can specialize in the sword, holy, or defensive skill trees. Of course, points are limited, so you will be tasked with using them sparingly. The more you focus on one branch of the skill tree, the more impactful your abilities will become, so you're encouraged to hone in as you go. This experimentation was a big part of the draw for me, despite dying setting you back into square one and right there at the first floor. And even the start of the dungeon can be a hurdle when you're starting out. On the first floor alone, you can encounter mini-bosses, insta-kill spikes, insta-kill traps, and all manner of strange enemies out to kill you. Bear in mind, this is the easiest part of the adventure. I can say this because after a long enough time mucking around in those caves, you eventually download all the tricks it can throw your way. Boulder trap? Yeah, you know what the pressure plate looks like now. Let's lure this stupid slime in and turn the trap against our enemies. Feeling competent in Vagante just based on knowing what the game can throw at you is a rewarding feeling few other games can touch. But then you reach the end of the caves and it's time to learn all the new tricks in the forest. There's golems here, and whatever this plant is? Oh boy. The ever-evolving nature of the dungeon means you're never seeing the same layout or trap twice. The game's going to keep you guessing. But you also have to contend with things like scrolls and potions having a different effect every time you play. A red potion will do the same thing for your entire run, but next time you enter the dungeon, it could do something else entirely. Fortunately, not everything in the dungeon is constantly changing. Some things, like shrines, are constant. And what does this shrine do? This is the Shackled. Sounds friendly. Well, the only way to find out what they do is to either look it up online or tinker with it in-game. For example, this Iron Maiden, it wants blood. Yours will do, but maybe that tiny fairy you were gonna help actually fits perfectly in here. I don't know. Once you've paid the price, you'll be rewarded with a stat boost. It's on you whether or not sacrificing a fairy to an unknowable being of infinite power and darkness that chooses to manifest its shrines as Iron Maidens is the correct moral choice.
This right here is my favorite thing ever. In the history of forever. I think about this every day. I think about this all night long. I stay awake, not sleeping, because I'm thinking about this.
If you want to succeed in this game, you're going to need to learn the ins and outs of how things interact, especially because you start from square one every time you die. Until you do, you'll find Vagante to be very inhospitable. I'm not too proud to admit that I absolutely cannot get past the third biome, the catacombs, even after 8 hours of play. I'm also happy to admit that I'm definitely going to be diving back in and getting destroyed by this game more in the future. And while these kind of difficulty curves are definitely an acquired taste, the mood that Vagante sets keeps drawing me in. I don't know if I'll ever beat it. In fact, I don't even know if beating the game will be the point. There's still a lot to discover with its intricate systems. And I haven't even touched co-op, which seems pretty cool. All things said, Vagante was a very rewarding experience, and one I hope to revisit in the future. But until then, Coming in at under 700 reviews, we have the very retro-looking Astalon Tears of the Earth. A big challenge with this game was getting over some of my recent distaste for games that feel a little too indebted to this particular retro aesthetic. I don't know why all these 8-bit throwbacks wore out their welcome with me as quickly as they did, but I think I got burned by this post-Shovel Knight gold rush I lived through for a period there. Thankfully, in spite of all of this, Astalon Tears of the Earth, or Astalon as I'll be calling it from here on out, leans into a lot of the better qualities of these throwback titles. The game plays in a very classic Metroidvania style. Astalon checks almost every box the genre is known for. RPG elements are present thanks to skill and level progression, lots of backtracking, platforming, all over a huge, sprawling map with lots of hidden nooks and crannies. Of course, things like secret walls and shortcuts are everywhere, another genre staple. This game isn't looking to change everything you know about Metroidvania titles. In a more generous take, it's more of a refinement on the genre than a radical reinvention. So if you don't like the genre, I sincerely doubt this one will be changing your mind. Astalon takes place in a post-apocalyptic planet where a war has ravaged the world, sending it back to the Dark Ages. I suppose the planet is Earth because, Earth is in the title, but I don't know, maybe they just meant the ground. Tears of the Soil doesn't really sound as epic, but in this world, mankind is divided into small colonies, and one small village is eking out a life when a poisoned water supply begins to kill off the very few precious people left. Luck would have it, the culprit here is pretty close. There's an ominous tower filled with terrifying giants of stone called Gorgons, so our three heroes set out to stop the issue and infiltrate the deadly tower. You take the roles of three characters, Arias the fighter, Kiuli the rogue, and Algus the wizard, as you make your way through this sprawling tower and find the source of the malady. However, this tower, being the home of a race of ancient godlike beings, does make it a little hard for a normal person to just kinda kick in the door and do what they want. So our wizard, Algus, decides to hedge his bet by making a secret pact with the Titan of Death, Epimetheus. All of this story literally takes place in the opening text crawl and acts as set dressing as you explore the tower. The game isn't particularly story heavy, but does have a couple fun twists here and there as you progress. Graphically, the game is very indebted to the NES. Since each section of the dungeon is dominated by a single color, enemies are presented by having contrasting colors so they don't bleed into the background, a trick employed since the early NES days. Following this same line of thought, your heroes are each a bright color, Arias in blue, Kiuli in red, and Algus in orange. Largely though, Astalon employs some of the same little tricks that made Shovel Knight work graphically. Lots of parts are made to look like the way you remember an 8-bit title looking as a kid, but doing things like subtly expanding the color palette and resolution in order to add more depth and excitement to levels. It's the perfect way to align how your nostalgia fits with how it actually looked. A very similar approach of quietly modernizing aspects is employed within the gameplay itself as well. In Astalon, you control three characters. You'll be choosing between them as you make your way through the tower, with each offering up places where their skills would come in handy. Kiuli can fire her bow long range and boost off walls for higher jumps. Arias can shoulder charge through some walls and reflect attacks back with his dinky sword and, he helmet have horns. Algus is the wizard and the best attack in the game, and so, that's enough said there. Oh, also, small detail, he has made a pact with the god of death. Gameplay-wise, this pact manifests itself in interesting ways. Every time you die in Astalon, which in my experience is far more often than you'd think, you're brought before the Titan of Death, Epimetheus. Conveniently, he'll let you make some purchases using soul points you've collected in the tower to power up your next run. Each character can have their stats improved or new abilities unlocked. Once you've spent to your heart's content, he will then rebuild the corpses of you and your allies and plop you back in the front of the tower, ready to start again. But this isn't time travel or a roguelike. It resets the memories of Algus and his companions, but any changes you've done to the tower remain. And if Dark Souls has taught me anything, no price is too great to pay for a shortcut. And yeah, sure, your friends are starting to get the sense that they're in a loop of death and pain as they journey through the tower, likely scarring them for life as I choose to continue to hide the truth from them, but not a whole lot beats the satisfaction of opening up a shortcut on a map. I guess the real adventure was the shortcuts we opened along the way. Now, challenge-wise, I found Astalon to sit in the pretty challenging but I'm not going to throw the controller territory. Boss fights are actually, I think, the easiest part. It's your standard fare of learning patterns and knowing when your opportunity to strike is. Honestly, the real difficulty is just getting around this tower. The main problem is save points are pretty far and few between, and there isn't really any healing items dropped from downed enemies. Methods of healing do show up later in the game, but until then it's just deal with it until you can unlock a shortcut to make your journey easier next time. If you get a rest cutscene at a campfire you're able to heal, but those are few and far between. You're also able to break open candles to restore health, but that is a limited resource that has to be paid for. The candles can be refilled when you die, but that will cost you your precious upgrade points, so I usually just took it on the chin while I played. And if you're 20 feet from unlocking a shortcut when you died, that doesn't matter, it's back to the entrance. While yes, you're going to get upgrades to your character and be stronger as you make your way back to where you were, so not all is lost, it can really be annoying to get plopped back at the front entrance again. The other catch is none of the upgrades have descriptions, and while you're likely going to want to unlock most things, not knowing what to prioritize can be really frustrating. What does Titan's ego do? Well, it marks his statues on your map, of course. If you like games with opaque elements like this, then it'll be a treat for you, I'm sure, but I went ahead and looked up what everything did, and I don't feel like it hurt the experience at all. A couple minor quibbles aside, there's a lot on offer for Astalon. It's certainly no Hollow Knight, but it is a really well-made entry for fans of the genre and worthy playthrough for anyone else in the Silksong waiting room who doesn't really get upset at a very retro aesthetic. With under 2,500 reviews, there's Lunacid, the latest project by Akuma Kira, co-creator of classic YouTube jump scare sensation Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion and claustrophobia nightmare horror simulator Lost in Vivo. Akuma Kira's games evoke a very specific aesthetic and usually deal with the macabre horror, but this time they're tackling something a bit different. And maybe it'll be easiest to read the incredibly succinct store page description on Steam. Lunacid is a first-person dungeon crawler inspired by old FromSoft games like Shadow Tower and Kingsfield. If you're anything like me, that was enough for you to go to the Steam page and at the very least wishlist it. But for the rest, let's dig a little bit deeper. Lunacid looks to modernize some of the issues that might make revisiting a Kingsfield a little more clunky today. Things like movement feel a lot more immediate than they did in a Kingsfield game. As a result, this title feels a little more action-oriented and faster. The irony of me saying that is this is like comparing a turtle to a snail in terms of speed. Both games are very slow. Don't kick in the door expecting twitchy precision combat. In fact, don't kick in the door at all. This game rewards slow, methodical play. The DNA of future Souls games is in Kingsfield's titles, and so in Lunacid you'll find some of that same careful gameplay. Aesthetically, the game makes no qualms about following in the footsteps of its predecessor. I mean, they write it in the description, so I hope it does. It's Kingsfield down to the almost purposefully gloomy and repeating textures and condensed voiceover on your opening text crawl. What is that opening text crawl? Well, long ago an unknowable creature emerged from the sea, covering the world in a poisonous mist. In response, society has splintered, creating feudal kingdoms. And expect dead gods, undead, and forbidden magic to await you, surely. This probably all sounds very familiar if you've played a FromSoft game, but there are a few things that set it apart. Your protagonist is an ousted member of society, whose punishment is to be dropped into the Great Well, a huge labyrinth where the undesirable parts of society are tossed. None have before escaped, but you seek to uncover the truth and find your freedom. Where Lunacid starts to set itself apart is the world building and story using tiny little interesting devices. For example, there are VHS tapes on the intro screen. This might imply a world that was further along in technology than perhaps you'd guess by all the swords and sorcery. While you start with no knowledge of the outside world beyond the opening text crawl, you'll slowly start to peel back the layers of the world above the well. As far as pacing is concerned, Lunacid opens very slowly and very purposefully. I mean this as a compliment. You'll notice the time it takes to run into an enemy is actually pretty high if you compare it to other dungeon crawling games. Lunacid isn't afraid to just have you walk through dark, empty corridors for a little while. This feeling's enhanced by the extremely moody compositions by Akuma Kira, Jaren Christ, and Thor High Heels. Hearing the reverb-laden, droning synths as you go through an empty hallway goes a long way towards setting a mood. These songs can go from cool beats to steady relax to experimental bells music with haunting reverb that sounds like it's being played a room over. Despite how different those things sound, there's a cohesive vision and through line to this soundtrack that really helps sell the world. With difficulty, Lunacid cuts down on the rather painful trial and error that its forerunner had, but a part of me missed the feeling of exploring a harsh, unforgiving land. A game's world can feel a little more dangerous and a little bit more realized when you stand a chance to run into something you're not ready for. For those of you not familiar with the original Kingsfield games, there was a pretty high chance that you would just go the wrong way and run into something that would kill you very, very fast. And while there are certainly things that can kill you, and things that can kill you very fast, Lunacid really does away with a lot of that. Removing some of the dread of rounding a corner and dying to something immensely powerful makes Lunacid feel a little more straightforward by comparison, both in its dungeon layouts and even difficulty curve. So for some people that'll probably be a plus. I'm hesitant to call it a fault with the game though, I think it's more a matter of taste. Not to say this game is extremely new school in its approach. It still isn't afraid to disrespect your time. Lunacid operates on the old school philosophy of dying kicks you back to your last save, and the save points are pretty far and few between. If you haven't saved in 20 minutes and you die, that means 20 minutes is gone. Just don't think about how you have a limited number of hours on the planet and it's fine. That means if an enemy drops a particularly shiny magic ring that you like, you should probably turn around right away and go save, so as not to lose your lucky drop. Mechanically, this keeps the pacing slow and methodical, very true to its inspiration. I know some people can't stand losing progress, but I do like some stakes when I'm playing this type of game. I want to sweat a little bit. Having consequences helps reinforce that you're in a dangerous place. And so while cutting back on some of the more hardcore elements of the old Kingsfield games, there's still some challenge in patience requiring mechanics at play here. Speaking of mechanics, let's chat about combat. Lunacid's a fast-paced game if you've played a Kingsfield, and it's very slow if you've played anything else made in the last 5 years. But I'm here for it. I like that it's purposeful. Yeah, that's the word I'm going to use. I like purposeful combat. There's two approaches to harming your opponent in Lunacid: weaponry and magic. Weaponry includes things like bows, swords, daggers, clubs. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner you have a charge meter. Holding down the attack button before releasing at max charge means your weapon will do the most damage it can do, while spamming lighter attacks with an uncharged bar does less damage in exchange for speed. I prefer a slower approach. You see, me use big sword. Big sword good. Love big sword. Big sword strong. Other weapons are lithe and quick like rapiers and daggers, so the hit and run techniques are valid, but are they valid? They're really not big swords, are they? Enemies also hit hard in this game, so you'll want to stay on your toes. Baiting attacks, much like the Kingsfield games, is a good way not to end up damaged or with status ailments. I can't tell you how often I died to poison when I first found these skeleton slimes. We laugh, but I hate these skeleton slimes. Much like a lot of RPGs, the game isn't looking to lock you into any particular playstyle. You're free to play however you like. Spells are certainly a powerful choice as well. Discovering rings will allow you to equip magic to one of two available slots. Some rings are in set locations, and others can be random drops from opponents. There's a lot of utility in the spells you can find, and I think when I inevitably play this game on full release, I might go Spellcaster because there's so many cool abilities. You can range from stuff like offensive spells to even summoning familiars to help you in battle. Mentioning builds, this game does go the Souls-like route of building your character by allocating stats earned from defeating monsters. Levels gain you more attribute points that you can allocate to make your build as specialized as you like. So, for example, if you want to be a warrior, you'll want to go in strength and dexterity. You know, you've seen this before. Of course, you'll also want to upgrade weapons and buy items, and the game offers a town of sorts. Lunacid has a safe haven in the form of Wing's Rest, a section of the well protected by fading ancient magics. It's here that you can upgrade weapons, buy items with your hard-earned money, chill with a cool skeleton drinking buddy, or chat up the resident anime demon waifu if you'd like. I've already spent a lot of time, but I will say Lunacid is shaping up to be something truly special, and I mentioned earlier, this game's still in early access. The full release currently is planned, as of me writing this, for the end of October, which, assuming I haven't goofed up, is still in the future when the video comes out. For the price of $7 in early access, you're getting a lot of very fun game already. It's great to see the older FromSoft games make an impact on the gaming space even today. We get a lot of Souls clones, but when am I gonna get my Shadow Tower clone? Well, ta-da! But even divorcing this from its influence, Lunacid is just a very solid, fun dungeon crawler that can stand on its own and may even make a few new fans for the genre along the way. This world needs more slightly janky, first-person dungeon crawlers. Well, for me, I'm the world in this scenario. I need them. With a rather small 359 comments on itch.io and a shout out from video game YouTube legend Video Game Donkey, Franken might be on a few more radars than some of the other games on this list, but I really do have to do my part to make sure it's on a few more. Especially because, and I can't stress this enough, the game is free. Do you play a lot of RPGs or know a lot of anime tropes? Then Franken is probably an easy recommendation. Clocking in around 1 hour, start to finish, Franken is a work of satire made by someone who clearly loves the genre. Very similar to another game I reviewed on this channel, Moon, Franken will give you more or less depending on how familiar you are with the tropes it's in conversation with. If you like Final Fantasy IV, the Dragon Quest series, or are a big fan of games being kind of funny, well, good news. If the opening text crawl doesn't make it abundantly clear, Franken lives in the realm of goofy parody. So I decided to go with the flow and I named my character Bippy. Yes, heroic name. Oh, brave Bippy. Bippy is the man for the job when it comes to saving the kingdom, because the king thought he looked unassertive and easy to boss around. Weirdly, that part made me reflect inwardly a lot more than it probably should have. You see, there's an evil knight destroying the land, the horrifying, and all caps, Hell's Knight. And Bippy, brave and true, must save the day. Your adventure will cover all the NES RPG hits, generic enemies with palette swaps, dragons guarding treasure, bad guys burning towns, goblins that are very interested in sand, and of course, a plucky thief. I'm gonna say zero more about the game though, because it really sorta is a series of short gags and in-jokes all wrapped in an amusing enough RPG. The irreverent dialogue is the star of the show, to be sure. There isn't a whole lot of gameplay here. The game proper plays a little like a puzzle game. It's all about making sure you have the right equipment for each encounter, and then battles have one button: attack. This all sounds kinda dry on paper, but there are very few battles to actually fight, and to top it off, they're quickly resolved. Typically, they're used as an excuse to interact a little more with whomever you're battling at the moment. In that sense, battles in this game are much like how I use carrots as nothing more than a reluctant participant in shoveling ranch dressing into my ranch receptacle. Oh, for those of you not from the States, we call our mouths ranch receptacles here. Respectacle my receptacle is a common idiom around the States. It means, please listen carefully to my words. But enough culture lesson for one day. The soundtrack has an amazing breadth of variety. It can go from 80s synthwave to songs that sound like they would not be out of place in an 80s mecha anime. It is very, very cool to hear this old, kind of interesting sound that you don't hear a lot anymore. Even the horns feel dated. And yeah, maybe some of the tracks on here ignore copyright law, but when you get to the final boss and the Galaxy Railways opening theme song is the background music, it's like, yeah, of course this is the right song for this moment. This is the absolute best song for this moment. And after all, the game is free, so I don't think anyone's really profiting off of these songs. The main issue I have with Franken is I can't tell when the game isn't poking fun at an established trope. It's very funny, but it also wears its heart on its sleeve completely. Is the game making me wander the world without a clear sense of purpose once I find the airship as a deconstruction of the aimless middle act of Dragon Quest III? Or perhaps they just did this because the world opened up and they wanted you to explore? I honestly don't know. The game clearly loves old Japanese RPGs. If you were to play a JRPG bingo, you'd very likely cover the whole board by the time you beat Franken, and that's only 1 hour. The game seems to be proud of and making fun of its inspirations all at the same time. That honesty that the game has mixed in with the satire is actually what makes the game such a great adventure. And while I definitely wasn't weeping at the credits, I certainly was smiling really big. If any of this sounded remotely interesting, Franken is totally free, so the price to entertainment ratio is pretty good on this one. With the notable honor of being the game on this list with the most reviews, just under 4,000, is 2014's One Way Heroics. The number skews a bit too because it's kinda two games. I combined the total scores of both here. The initial release was followed by a remake 2 years later by Spike Chunsoft. Steam has recommended this game to me several times before, and I think the rather workmanlike graphical aesthetic kept me from jumping in several times, but I have to say I'm so happy I managed to work up the nerve to do it this time. The closest parallel I could draw would be Half Minute Hero, but One Way Heroics is a little less tongue-in-cheek. It's hard to explain why One Way Heroics works so well, but I plan on spending the next few minutes trying my best. This game is very much more than the sum of its parts. At its heart, One Way Heroics is a mystery dungeon game. If you've never played a mystery dungeon or Fushigi no Dungeon game, they all play by similar rules. The gameplay feels almost a little like a board gamified JRPG. In fact, someone more smart and concise than me might just call it a Japanese roguelike. You're typically presented with a top-down dungeon on a grid, and walk around a lot like an old SNES Zelda game until the enemy shares the screen with you. At that point, you can feel free to browse your items and collect your bearings, but once you make a move, every monster on the screen gets to take theirs. When this came out in the 90s, I'm sure it was a pretty clever abstraction of turn-based RPGs, especially if you hadn't played classics like Rogue. This genre of game works on a very simple but addictive loop. Dive into dungeon, get loot, get stronger, go back into dungeon, die, lose everything, feel sad, go back into dungeon, repeat. And while mystery dungeon games are very defined and usually have a stringent set of rules, this game really sets itself apart mechanically by pulling out the scale to that of an overworld map and adding a huge wave of stuff, slowly absorbing the entire west side of the map. Does it look friendly? Well, if for some strange reason you answered yes, I have very unfortunate news, because that's an all-consuming void. Oh man. Turns out a wicked summoner has called upon these evil powers and the world is being hella wiped out, to be scientific about it. Like many roguelikes, One Way Heroic is a per-run game. Every time you begin an adventure, you're greeted by the king, who informs you that the world is ending, and then, depending on the difficulty you chose, will explain that you must travel a certain number of kilometers to the right and confront the source of the problem. And when the king says the world is ending, he means it too. The dark wave is literally at your doorstep at this point. Most people in the universe have very little desire to outrun this disaster. They will hold their ground. Exceedingly stoic, they will talk about how death is incoming and they're just kinda cool with it. With the way this ominous darkness travels, you won't have a lot of time to think about how accepting of death the locals are, though. The pace is something akin to a turn-based take on those Mario levels, the old 2D ones that automatically scroll. And just because you have time to think about your next move doesn't mean the game won't be happy to burp out random events at you and really screw you up. Sometimes demons just drop out of the sky and just ruin a well-laid plan. This is to say nothing of the fact that just the run-of-the-mill enemies in the little dungeons crawling with treasure and monsters threaten to take up precious time that you have to explore before it's completely wiped out. So you'll need to weigh when to engage in combat and when to run. The same analytical approach needs to be taken with terrain as well. Moving over flatlands costs 1 turn, but a mountain is going to cost you 10. Meaning if you try and cross a mountain range, the calamity will almost certainly overtake you with great ease, unless your character class is equipped to climb mountains. The game's mechanics are very smartly tied to reminding the player thematically of what's going on. The apocalypse is here, and it's waiting for no one. Typically in mystery dungeon titles, you have a hub town with a sprawling multi-floor dungeon attached to it. And yeah, I guess this is a given, but that dungeon is mysterious. Because you spend the whole time spelunking, the typical experience is very tight with winding corridors that open up into bigger rooms. However, One Way Heroics is generating an entire world map where you move through a more wide-open, procedurally generated biome. The scale of this game is what really helps sell the feeling that it's an epic adventure, even if sometimes it's a little random. And that randomness is going to extend to the location names too. I mean, who can forget about the prairie? Why do these fields peter off into volcanic wasteland? Don't think about it too much. There's treasure in there somewhere. We don't have time to worry about how on Earth this planet looks because it's being actively destroyed. You also don't have the structure of hub towns that the OG Mystery Dungeon games have, and instead, you bump into little camps or settlements along your way. Thankfully, you can use items to make them more apparent on your map because missing them can be pretty easy if you don't know what to pay attention for, and really set you back. These small, abstracted towns are essential because you'll slowly be depleting your energy as you travel across the land. The best way to restore energy is eating a meal from a chef in town, so stopping to grab a bite can be essential to making your journey a successful one. Many of the towns have item vendors and blacksmiths as well, so money you pick up along the way can be quickly spent to build your strength for the final encounter. The catch is you have to be very concise about visiting towns because there is that huge disaster on the side of the screen and, oh baby, it creeps. So you gotta kinda blitz through to all the merchants and vendors in order to make sure you set yourself up for success. Don't worry about the fact that they've decided to sit still as the ever-consuming void finds them. They're fine. Their dedication is to running a store. They're gonna die, and you're gonna die too, probably. At least for your first couple runs. The game presents a fair challenge and a unique run every time, but the best way to ensure your success is to use things like your awakening skills every time to their fullest. Any attempt at saving the world, however, win or lose, will net you some currency for spending toward your subsequent run. You can unlock new classes, or more importantly, put space in your vault. The vault mechanic allows you to take a certain number of items found during your previous run on to the next. This is by far what I found to be the most essential upgrade for success in the game. Bringing that really good sword on the next run can be such a boon and can take away the sting of an early death from a sloppy mistake, because at least you get that cool sword back. You can also unlock new perks and classes to apply to characters. None of the unlocks feel particularly game-breaking, rather they just let you play the game in new ways. Tired of just swinging your sword the whole time? Unlock one of the other classes and change how you approach the world. I like the pirate class. They look cool, they can pick locks, and they use axes, which is quite nearly a big sword if you ask me. Choosing a new class can help you find a playstyle or present a fresh challenge to keep things new. Just keep in mind the classes probably won't be what wins you a run through. It'll be knowing what the game is capable of throwing at you. A big key to success is knowing what items to hold on to. For example, a teleport potion zaps you to a random square on the map. And while at first glance this doesn't sound outstandingly helpful, in practice it's one of the biggest lifesavers. You can get out of a sticky situation with enemies, you can get unstuck from terrain, and in the final fight I used it to grab a moment to heal, eat, and compose myself before the big bad made their way to me. There's lots of little bits of gained knowledge like this that go a long way to securing your next run. It's nice that my success didn't feel like it required me to have multiple runs of this game. In fact, anecdotally, I beat the remake on my first try just by knowing my character's skills and what items to use in what situation. Which means I need to touch briefly on the fact that there are two versions of this game. The original title was the work of a single developer, Smoking Wolf. Really makes you wonder why I chose this lame-ass username when you could just call yourself Smoking Wolf. The original version of the game was good. So good, in fact, that Spike Chunsoft, the inventor of the Mystery Dungeon games, ended up asking if they could make a version of the game as well, which seems like a pretty high compliment to me. Looking at the Steam reviews, it's clear the new changes weren't taken so well. They added traps, which introduced maybe a little too much RNG to the game for my taste. Luckily, they can be toggled to visible, which makes them a non-issue if you're playing through and want a more classic experience. Where I found my personal challenge though was it being even harder to see towns on the minimap. Not a game breaker by any means, but a little annoying. However, not all the changes they implemented were bad. There's new classes available and include characters from their other games like the Ultimate Student from Danganronpa and the Wanderer from Shiren the Wanderer. And while this title has improved graphics and artwork, I don't think either game's going to necessarily win an award for being cutting edge. The new version looks a lot cleaner, and the original sorta has an indie game charm to it. Largely though, the original game's a little more pure in its focus and balance, and I guess if I had to choose one, I would pick the original. It's also a steal at under $5. Honestly though, if you absolutely can't stand the style of the old one, the remake is built on the same very solid foundation. But however you do it, give it a try. Seriously, they're both doing similar things and they both run on the Steam Deck. That means it might be my favorite couch game right now. So, yeah. I don't know, next game. Coming in with just under 500 reviews, but being a little new, so it has time to take off. We have the very Game Boy looking Void Stranger. This is by System Erasure, the same development team that made the very fun, and similar in some ways shoot 'em up, Zero Ranger. Void Stranger is not a shmup, however. It's a Sokoban-style puzzle game, which means I have to immediately kind of say, this is only somewhat of an RPG. But I'm gonna explain that a little bit more in depth later. A Sokoban game, if you aren't familiar, gets its namesake from the 1980s Japanese game Warehouse Keeper, or Sokoban. In that game, you move boxes around in order to cover the appropriate squares and proceed to the next stage. It's a very simple concept, and one that a lot of games have lifted for their mini puzzles, but mercifully, they don't make it the whole experience because doing this can be exhausting. The genre, for me at least, has a very strong tendency to go from, hey, this is neat, to crying on the kitchen floor, clutching the controller to my chest while I eat shredded cheese. Straight from the bag. Oh, right. Void Stranger, by comparison, doesn't quite reach the headache-inducing levels that old-school Sokoban games do, but it's not easy, and it makes up for that by being really weird. You play as someone stuck in a labyrinth with no idea why they're there. For the bulk of the gameplay, you'll be using a magical staff to move blocks around in order to solve puzzles. Each puzzle represents the floor of a dungeon as you make your way through. And I'm aware some of you are probably asking, isn't this list for RPGs? And in a sense, Void Stranger is, but it's also a lot of things. Do I sound like an insane person? Well, that's because I'm trying to be coy. You see, this game gets a full-throated recommendation from me, but I don't want to tell you anything about it. I will say this, if you're a fan of tricky puzzles, breaking game rules, and fourth wall breaking, kind of like One Shot or Undertale, then please consider ignoring the rest of this segment and just trying this game for yourself. The less you know about this one, the better. Once this bar here at the bottom is up, I'm going to talk about things that are probably better left to be discovered through play, so you've been warned. I'm not going to spoil anything related to the story, but the surprise is kind of the charm. Here, look at this series of kittens I drew by hand. Oh, clock's ticking. Alright, here's chapter 1 of Moby Dick. And we're off to the spoiler not spoiler zone. As I mentioned, Void Stranger is presented in a Game Boy adjacent graphical style. Sparse setting of Void Stranger gives way to some creative and sometimes horrifying set pieces. They use the monochromatic palette and somewhat simple pixel art to great effect. The cool thing about old pixel art is your imagination is allowed to fill in some of the gaps, and the creators of this game are taking advantage of that. That's not to say everything here is fully old school though. The music betrays a very modern sensibility, well beyond the chipset of a Game Boy. Now, the songs will try and hide sounding like old MIDI keyboards here and there, and to be fair, the instruments are limited, but when a song really gets cooking, you're left with something more akin to a track you might have found on a PlayStation 1. Which is great, because that extra fidelity can be put to good use to help sell some of the sweeter and creepier moments this game offers. Also, many of the tracks will keep you pleasantly bobbing your head as you scratch your brain trying to find the solution to a difficult puzzle. The puzzles, they start pretty easy at first. You can move the blocks along to get where you need to go, and once you get the basics down, you'll find the system is very flexible. There are multiple solutions to many of these puzzles. However, the game is continually throwing in new wrinkles in the form of creatures and denizens that will inhabit your labyrinth. Some might chase you, others patrol a single area. Every move you make, they'll take an action, so the result is a slow, thoughtful pace for the harder levels. To say this game gets nasty on some of the puzzles can be a bit of an understatement. Bearing that in mind, the biggest barrier to fun this game can have is the unevenness of some of its puzzles. Some puzzles would stump me for 20 minutes or so, and then give way to 5 to 10 in a row I could complete without a single thought. The whiplash of this makes the longer puzzles a little more frustrating than they need to be, especially when there's a somewhat interesting, if not vague, story at play here. What makes Void Stranger unique, however, and I guess an RPG in some senses, is how it uses gameplay to keep you on your toes. When you reach a sanctuary floor throughout your adventure, or one without a puzzle, you're asked if you'd like to rest. If you say yes, the game will very much take you at your word and close itself completely. When you return, however, you won't be doing a Sokoban puzzle right away. You'll be doing, well, anything else. It could be a rhythm game, an RPG segment, or maybe a visual novel portion. But Void Stranger is filled with this same restless energy throughout. The game doesn't really want to fit comfortably into a box. I'm still being vague though because I think part of the game's value is that it is pretty much a giant mystery box. If you ever read one of its patch notes, it's all spoiler tags. There's so many odd sequence breaks, Easter eggs, and fourth wall breaks throughout its runtime that it wouldn't surprise me if a year from now someone is still finding something new in the game. Even after completing all 200 plus floors of puzzles, I still feel like I'm barely scratching the surface of what's contained within this game. I didn't get a clean story or credits, I got a vague hint that there was more, and I was thrown back in. Sure enough, too, I went ahead and played a few more hours and noticed more differences. The only catch is a lot of the strangeness is locked even further behind harder difficulty levels for your second playthrough. A lot like the studio's last game. Nevertheless, there's much to unpack here, and I look forward to some big-brained YouTube puzzle master putting all this together for me and giving me a lore dump because this game is cool. Oh, and it has this big, tasteful snake character. No notes. I don't think I represented a single traditional turn-based JRPG on this list yet, so let's remedy that really quick. Let's chat about Alterium Shift. The last 12 months or so have seen two pretty big indie JRPGs in the RPG space show up and get some attention, Chained Echoes and Sea of Stars. Both of these try and scratch that same itch of classic dyed-in-the-wool SNES era RPGs, but then updating them with what a lot of people might call more modern sensibilities. Alterium Shift is looking to do something very similar in its approach and has some very good groundwork already. But before I say anything else about this game, I think it's worth noting it is very early access. Anecdotally, I had it freeze several times as I was playing it. But there is a lot of potential here and enough for me to talk about. I might not go too deep in any critique in this game because it's all very subject to change and it could be different in 4 months. Alterium Shift opens in your standard idyllic JRPG town. An entity, aptly named Entity, says some very ominous things about finding a hero to save existence, and then we're asked to pick our main character. We're given the choice of playing either Atlas, the ranger, Sage, the wizard, or Pyra, the warrior. If this sounds familiar, well, everyone has you pick these classes, another one of these games in this list has you pick these classes, but this is kind of standard boilerplate fare, and that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. As far as I've reached with Alterium Shift, it didn't really look to upset any classic JRPG staples. This game is going for a comfort food nostalgia vibe, and that can be good too. Each character has their own route and personality, but starts with the same basic premise. You are at a school training gifted children and take control of the chosen hero on the day of their final exam before graduating. This exam has a real deal written test portion. The game asks you to actually study, like really study. They have books of world history laying around that you're expected to crack open and read for this test. I wasn't ready for that. Please game, no homework. To top that off, the game pulled a disappointed dad on me after I did terribly on the test. Anyway, after being berated for being an idiot, then you set out on a minor quest that will line up the dominoes for the story. This leads each character's path branching into different storylines. I picked Atlas, the ranger. However, at these crystals, you can switch to whichever character you want to play as, so don't feel too locked in on your decision. Each character comes with the promise of a different path, so depending on who you pick, your journey could be a little different. For example, Sage is very sassy, and Pyra is very honorable, I guess. Pyra is kind of more of a boilerplate, but she hits hard. Presentation-wise, the game is sort of like Octopath Traveler's HD 2D engine, but with much less in the way of bloom effects. The sprite work itself is a little reminiscent of Seiken Densetsu 3 as well. And thanks to a locked camera angle, all the pixel art and stages still feel like an updated version of your old school SNES RPG. The pixel art is lovely throughout, which makes the world feel pretty cohesive. While very beautiful, some of the larger areas like the forest suffer from the issue of splitting your dungeons into multiple screens. I think this would be less of a problem if there was a clear indication that you were about to zone into the next map. When you leave an old map, every enemy respawns, so accidentally going too far to the left means you need to fight all those battles while you look for the real path forward. Now, I'm no game designer by any respect, but I think adding little markers to zones and maybe pulling the camera out just a little bit in dungeons would really help here. It's a minor complaint, and I got through every dungeon, it just made them a little bit more tedious than they needed to be. Speaking of dungeons, we have some Lufia 2 style puzzle work here too, which I am very excited to see. I'm always happy to have dungeon puzzles, anything better than just a maze. The world itself has a deep backstory involving alternate dimensions and dark elves. There's clearly a bit of lore here. My freezes happen around the 5-hour mark with this game, so unfortunately I didn't get to explore everything the story has to offer, but it looks to be setting up something with lots of possibility space for twists and turns. Are the dark elves actually bad? Has history been wrong about all that? I mean, maybe, but we'll see. The dialogue isn't exactly mind-blowing, a little basic, but very much true to a 16-bit RPG. The only issue I have with the writing at all is some early NPC dialogue is too on the nose in places in an attempt at being funny. I'll start by mentioning that humor is widely subjective, so if you find something an NPC has to say here funny, I won't be telling you you're wrong for finding the humor in it. In fact, I don't really count it as a mark against the game. Rather, my issue is less with the jokes and more with the tone. I don't like how flippant the NPCs are in terms of how they behave in the universe. There's a story involving the end of the world, and we're helping old women named Mrs. Oldsky and saving cats named Mr. Flurfykins. It feels a little like the writer is winking at you and being like, you know this is a game, right? But to further the confusion, this wacky pretense falls away very quickly as you progress through the game. Anyone involved in the story doesn't speak like this. The game isn't a comedy for all intents and purposes, and the opening hours have a tough time nailing down tone due to the dissonance of how the world seems to want to undercut my suspension of disbelief. If you're going to go for a carefree and pastoral town, there's better ways to communicate this to the player. As I said though, this is early access and a lot of this could be roughs or placeholders, so I won't dwell on the writing. As a person who writes multiple drafts for the thing you're listening to now, I know that the first one isn't the last one. Gameplay-wise, you have relatively straightforward set of JRPG rules with a nice focus on not being a slog. You'll see enemies on the map so they can be avoided, although sometimes it doesn't feel like they can be. No random battles though. Once you're in combat, fights are decently challenging and give you a lot of options as a player. The battle system telescopes pretty quickly and starts including things like limit breaks. In fact, the only complaints I can really find about the battle system are early on you just have one character, so it makes it a little hard to start getting exciting options, but once you build the party out, that really stops being as much of an issue. And a couple of the enemies felt a little spongy, but nothing egregious. The game does include one of my beloved overworld maps, and while they kind of feel like a dinosaur, the game uses it very cleverly here. There's a mechanic for overworld and travel by zone manually, which is kind of interesting. Once you locate these glowing rings, they'll unlock the fast travel, which will then drop you onto this world map to get around easy. I guess the developers shared my nostalgia for the world map. Also, there's the titular Alterium Shifting. Similar to Link to the Past, Alterium Shift has a light and dark world, and your hero is capable of traveling between them. It'll literally rotate the camera 180 degrees when you go into them, which felt like a clever reminder that you're in a 3D world. I'm looking forward to more fun, puzzles, and dungeons in the full game, but I'm gonna go ahead and stop here. I don't know if I'd recommend anyone go out and buy it at the moment, but I think this game has a lot of potential. And while the aforementioned bugs stopped me, I'm interested to see what this team's going to come up with for their 1.0 release. It's clearly a labor of love. Okay, sure, despite everything, I still have more games to share, but some of these are going to be a little quicker. Maybe I didn't play them long enough, maybe I didn't form enough of a critical opinion about it to really dig in, but I think these are all worth mentioning, so without further ado, we're off to the lightning round. Oh, these roguelikes the kids play sure seem great, but why don't they have cool, edgy art and an aesthetic Cody would describe as drippy? What's that? Brutal Orchestra, you say, and it's kind of like Lisa insofar as its dark humor? Oh, great news then. Brutal Orchestra is a turn-based RPG roguelike with an extreme focus on managing your resources. For example, attacking this fish will net you red orbs, but other types of move can generate different colored orbs, so you'll want to be acutely aware of what orbs your character's moves require. Be careful though, because lacking an orb means you'll pay the deficit with your character's HP. Worse still, having too many orbs means taking damage as well. This creates combat that is very deep and strategic and has a very large decision tree based on risk and reward. The core gameplay loop itself though is a pretty bog standard roguelike with you choosing Sometimes items, sometimes battles, sometimes random events. If you've played Slay the Spire, you're ready for this. But it does ooze style. I didn't play enough to give a really hard opinion, but the art style stuck with me. Oh, and you heal by licking your teammates. Brutal Orchestra gets an 8 out of B+ stars. Delver is a charming, if somewhat basic dungeon crawler with a Minecraft-adjacent aesthetic. The core gameplay loop feels nice. Loot is usually fun, enemy variety is nice, and there's all sorts of little details that makes the dungeon feel vaguely serene, but also very dangerous. You fight in first person and in real time, so get ready. You're gonna stab some slimes. Unfortunately for Delver, I think Vagante is a little more my speed, and the two games share a lot of DNA. But Delver's a lot friendlier and more approachable. So if all the hardcore stuff about Vagante was a little bit of a turnoff, maybe something more simplistic like Delver would be great. And listen to this song at the camp. Ooh, that's chill campfire music to study and relax to. I think all my favorite dungeon crawlers feature very thoughtful, ambient music. I don't know what that says about me on a mental health level, but that's not what we're here for. Hunt the Night feels very much like it's a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time for me personally. Punishing action games where you hunt the undead through desolate streets has been showing up a lot this year for me. Between Blasphemous 2, Lies of P, Wo Long, Ender Lilies, and Ghost Song all getting played by me this year, I shouldn't be surprised I'm a little fatigued. So I fell off before I could beat this game, but it feels a little underappreciated by the community at large. A top-down action RPG with more than a passing interest in the world of Bloodborne. This game is quite easy to sink into, and clearly a labor of love. You play as mute hero Vesper, whose role as a stalker has her hunting the undead. However, she also has a secret her organization can't know about. She herself possesses the dark power she's sworn to hunt. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't do anything remarkably fresh or new, but everything it sets out to do, it does competently. Not to mention the incredibly well done and pervasive tone the game sets. This is grimdark throughout, and it's not going to let up. Combat feels fast and responsive, with the exception of the very floaty shooting, which might be on purpose. Your darkness form can traverse spikes, so there's puzzles to break up the gloom in combat. And different weapons with varying playstyles means you can approach fights however you'd like. It's a really solid game, full of gothic horror and nice mood pieces like combing the remains of a ruined Victorian house. What it sets out to do, it does competently, and that's a lot more than I can say for some of the games I played while making this list. Also, the gorgeous cover art is reminiscent of Ayami Kojima's Castlevania work, so always a plus. Do you ever get mad that block is usually a worthless button in a lot of traditional turn-based RPGs? Well, if so, Helen's Mysterious Castle is here for you. The game has, hands down, one of the coolest battle systems I've played in an RPG, and it does it all while subverting every expectation you'd have for a game that opens up like this. Yes, that's right, those are default RPG Maker assets, just the ones that come with the pack. It looks so bad, but give it a chance. The story opens in the most dry way possible. The man in front of you says, "Don't go into the castle." That's it. He's the default character sprite and he tells you not to go there. This is what most people's first RPG Maker game looks like, so it's not really doing it a whole lot of favors or bringing to mind some of the better experiences I've had in my life. But hear me out. The moment you're dropped into a battle, there's not a lot RPG Maker about it. What it lacked in budget for everything else, it makes up for in the battle system. The game has a fully customized battle system. You need to manage the speed of your attack versus your enemies. So, if you use a broadsword with a speed of 10, but a skeleton is attacking with its bones at a speed of 3, you're going to get hit, and it only takes a few hits to bring you down. So instead, you'll want to block. But it's going to get deeper, much deeper. As you get more and more weapons, the choices get really varied. There's also kind of a story. Despite how it starts, there is a story. It's not that exciting, but by the time I rolled credits, I had a lot of admiration for the developer, Satsu, for putting together such a cool experience. Oh, and it's $2 US, so that's not really a high-risk purchase. Potato Flowers in Full Bloom looks about as dry as a bag of potatoes, which is kind of interesting because there's something really cool going on under the hood here. This game is a first-person dungeon crawler turn-based RPG, or DRPG, or Blobber, or Old People RPG as some people might call it. I call it a friend. A lot of this genre is usually made up by being very hardcore, and Potato Flowers in Full Bloom eschews a lot of that in favor of simplicity and a kind of ugly aesthetic, but there's charm to it. Look at this little diorama town. I mean, it's not all bad. All the combat in this game is fully deterministic. There is no question if an enemy will hit or miss you. It's right there on the board. There's not as much random number generation as your typical DRPG has, which means you lose a little bit of the element of surprise, but you get a little bit more stability. That being said, this title has many other elements that make it its own, including very fun dungeon puzzles. Also, this game has no random battles. Everything's on the map and you can see its level before you engage. And a very smart use of light as a resource. Once it depletes, you're going to want to turn around because wandering in the dark means bumping into big, mean monsters. Typically, this genre makes you want to turn around by slowly depleting your resources and asking you to limp back to the entrance if you've planned incorrectly. Here, we have that light to act as the same risk-reward system, all while being infinitely more approachable. While it might pare down too much for some, I think this is a great entryway into the DRPG genre and a lot of fun on its own. Unfortunately, I only gave the game about 6 hours, so I didn't feel fully qualified to give it a full review section. Judging by the Steam reviews though, my initial thoughts aren't for nothing. This game seems to be a good one. Maybe check it out. Maybe check anything out. Maybe check none of them out. Maybe it's time I wrapped this up. When I was a kid, it would have been realistic not to miss a single game. But now we have to come to terms with reality where the good stuff, just by law of numbers, can slip through the cracks. And while too many games is probably a good problem to have, it did spawn this idea for the video. It's sort of weird coming to terms with there being so many games. I grew up in an SNES household, and back then, assuming I had the money, which I didn't, it would have been possible for me to play every single RPG that had come out in a year. That really isn't the case anymore. I guess that's part of growing up though. Accepting that you're going to miss things in life, but enjoying the ones you do find to the fullest. Which is why I thought it would be apropos to do indie games for this. Games born of passion, of creativity. Not that big budget games don't have those, but there's something special about a game that didn't get the focus group treatment. Something that's more unabashedly a single creator's vision. I don't think of this video as like a buyer's guide, it's more like a sharing list. Not everything here is perfect, but hopefully you respectacled my receptacle and found something new or interesting. I can't see a world where most people like every single game on the list, but hopefully it encourages other people to get out there and look for some treasure among all the horny asset flip rubble that is the Steam store. Anyway, I had a great time putting all these reviews together, and I hope you enjoyed seeing all these unique games. If you want to push like or subscribe, know that I'll be very grateful. But as always, just thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Oh, come on. Seriously? Game of the year. Jessica, come check this out.